Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Power You Have. I'm your host, Pramila Jayapal, and it has been amazing to host this podcast and literally with every episode be able to showcase the power that each of you has and help you use your power as effectively as you can. Today, we are going to do things a little bit differently. We are in this really unprecedented time in this country. Government shutdown just started. The Republican government shutdown just started. And rather than bringing on a guest today, I wanted to just answer questions directly from you. And so I've been collecting these questions all week on my social media accounts. If you don't follow me yet, please be sure to do that. It's Rep. Jayapal on all accounts. And I'm going to start before we get to the questions with just a quick update. And of course, I have to start by talking about this Republican shutdown that we're currently in. Now, I want to note that I am recording this on Thursday afternoon as of 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday morning. The government was shut down. Trump and Republicans are in control of every part of government. They control the House, they control the Senate, they control the White House. And they have made clear on vote after vote that they don't want or feel that they need Democrats' votes to pass all of the horrific things that they are doing. But now their line is that it's us, Democrats, that are standing in the way, blocking them from keeping the government open. And it would be laughable if it wasn't such a serious, horrible situation that they have put the American people in. After months and months of making life harder and more expensive, Republicans shut down the government because they don't want to provide health care to the American people. They could not even come to the table to have a conversation about how we save healthcare in this country. And they didn't pretend that they were interested in negotiating, by the way, because Democrats stayed in Washington, D.C., ready to negotiate, ready to talk about how we keep the government open and make sure that we actually provide healthcare for the American people. Speaker Johnson sent his Republican members home. He sent them home. They went home. They're hosting fancy fundraiser events with their billionaire buddies. Maybe they're relaxing on vacation. Good for them. But you know what? Americans right now are suffering. And so Republicans refused to do their job and they left. They left Washington, D.C. last Thursday. We Democrats held the line. We said, we want to negotiate this. If you need our votes, then you need to cancel the cuts that were made to healthcare, to Medicaid, and the big bad betrayal bill. Cuts that mean that more than 15 million Americans are going to lose their healthcare, and millions of Americans are going to lose their food assistance. You know, I'm at home with my constituents in Seattle right now. I just flew back yesterday after the government shut down. And in Washington state alone, if these cuts go into effect, more than 328,000 people are going to lose their insurance. 14 rural hospitals would be at risk of closing. And the average premium for people who are using Obamacare would go up by $1,550, $1,550. And that is as the Republicans' big bad betrayal bill continues to raise all kinds of other costs, right? Just in Washington, that big bad betrayal bill is raising the average electric bill by $360. It's kicking students off of Pell Grants. It's making education less affordable. And it's actually eliminating over 9,000 manufacturing and energy jobs. So much for lowering costs on day one. That is what Donald Trump promised to do during the campaign. Do you remember that? Because I sure remember that. All through the campaign, he's like, day one, I'm going to lower costs for the American people. Day one, I'm going to stop all the wars around the world. Day one, this and that. Day one, broken promises. Day one, all the way to today in October. Time and time again, we see these promises made, promises broken. Now, we're told in Congress over and over again, the American people are told, oh, we have to cut spending. We can't afford the programs that Americans rely on, things like Medicaid, things like Social Security, things like Medicare. And I'll say that having a responsible budget is important. We all want to cut waste, fraud, and abuse. But let me be clear that their big bad betrayal bill actually gave $7 trillion of tax breaks to the wealthiest millionaires and billionaires, and it added $3.4 trillion to the deficit. It basically stole from you to give money to the wealthiest people in this country. It stole health care from millions of Americans, all so that they could give that tax break to billionaires. And they want you to be really distracted about this. They want you to forget that that ever happened. They want you to not think that they gave a tax break to the billionaires. That's why they cut your health care. They actually want you to blame immigrants for cutting their health care. But we're going to set it straight. That's why we're holding the line. Because Democrats want you to have affordable health insurance. We want you to be able to pay for your bills. We want hospitals across the country to stay open. And it's really that simple. That's what we're fighting for. We are fighting for the healthcare of the American people. We're saying, listen, it's simple. Cancel the cuts on healthcare, the Republican cuts to Medicaid. Make sure that we keep healthcare costs affordable and lower costs for Americans across the board. And we're willing to work with you to do that, but you have to be willing to actually negotiate this, not just act like, you don't need our votes. If you don't need our votes, then go ahead and pass whatever you want. But if you need our votes, then you need to sit at the table and save healthcare. And Republicans have just been flat out lying about these negotiations. One of the first lies they're telling is, oh, we can kick the can down the road and we can deal with healthcare later. But in fact, notices are going out right now in the next couple of days. All of you are going to get notices showing that premiums have more than doubled in some cases. In some cases, the expectation is premiums may go up by 75% if we don't address this healthcare crisis we're about to face of these Obamacare subsidies, Affordable Care Act subsidies expiring. If Republicans let those expire, millions of Americans are going to lose coverage or face these skyrocketing costs starting in October. And thanks to their big bad betrayal bill and all the things they've been doing to really shut down whatever healthcare we have for Americans right now, premiums have already been consistently rising. I bet you guys see that in your pocketbooks. The second myth that they're telling, now this is a good one, because once again, they're trying to distract you from the tax breaks they gave to the billionaires. And they're saying that Democrats are doing all of this because we want to give $1 trillion in health care to undocumented immigrants. Now, this is really absurd for so many reasons. And I'll try to give you a couple. But the first one is that Republicans' big bad betrayal bill took health care away from hundreds of thousands of people with lawful status in this country, including refugees and trafficking survivors. And what they don't want you to know is that undocumented immigrants have never been permitted to use their hard-earned money to purchase coverage through the Affordable Care Act or to receive comprehensive Medicare or Medicaid coverage. And I personally think that's ridiculous, but it is not one of the asks of this negotiation. I want to tell you why I think it's ridiculous, because I think it's really important that you know this. Just imagine, right, if you have a bunch of people that are part of a healthcare exchange, it actually brings the cost down because it puts more and more people into that exchange. If you take them out, and I'm not saying get federal subsidies, but even be able to buy in to the insurance exchange, if you take those people out of the exchange, and you say you don't get any coverage, you can't buy it, you can't pay for it, you certainly aren't getting any subsidies for it. That's never been the case. I'm just saying, how about letting them buy in to the coverage so that they're covered? Then what happens is if people don't have coverage, they're going to have to go use the emergency room. And so on every level, this idea that we let people in the richest country in the world go without insurance coverage, healthcare coverage, is ridiculous. But I want to bring it back to right now, because whatever the Republicans are telling you about this is a flat out lie. There is no attempt to try to give immigrants right now, to try to give immigrants healthcare coverage. It's just not part of the demand right now. And the reality is that immigrants are providing so much labor that supports these benefits for the rest of us. Now, our Democratic bill doesn't try to change that in this moment in any way, shape, or form. I've got the Medicare for All bill. We can talk about that some other time, that provides universal health care to everybody. But right now, what they're saying is just a complete lie. Now, another line, and it's pretty clever, you know, as far as their cleverness goes, is that they want to take $50 billion, that Democrats want to take $50 billion from rural hospitals. Oh my God, that sounds terrible, right? But here's the context. Zoom out. Republicans are the ones who cut $1 trillion from Medicaid in their big bad betrayal bill. And Medicaid is the thing that funds rural hospitals. Okay. So the $50 billion rural hospital fund that Republicans put together is like a slush fund that only makes up 5% of the funding that they cut from rural hospitals. So guess what? Yes, we want to reinstate the money that rural hospitals are entitled to. That is part of our proposal. Cancel the cuts and put the money back into rural hospitals. That's the demand. And they're trying to make it seem like somehow we're trying to cut rural hospitals. They did that in the big bad betrayal bill. That was a big part of what they did. So what I want you to know is that this is what we're fighting for. We are fighting for your healthcare. We are fighting for your hospitals to keep running. We are fighting for your families to be able to thrive, not just survive. And I know that a shutdown creates a tremendous amount of uncertainty and strain for so many people across the country. And so as we move into this shutdown, I know my office, if you're a constituent of mine, my office is open. We are all working for you. You can visit my website, linked in the show notes for details on what this shutdown means. And actually, you can do this if you're in any district. You can look at what does the shutdown mean for different agencies and how you can be affected. And of course, if you're in my district, call us. We'll give you whatever help we can possibly give you. Our office is remaining open during the shutdown. All right, I think it's question time. I got a ton of questions from you. And be sure to comment if you like this question and answer segment, because I'm actually thinking about trying to incorporate it into the podcast in all the episodes we do, because I want this to be a conversation. So we picked out some of the questions that we got. There were a lot of questions around the same topic sometimes, so we kind of combined them. But let me get started with those. All right, the first question is, how do we stop this president and his corrupt cronies? I mean, the grift is stunning. The grift is freaking stunning. Like, he's working on his hundreds of millions of dollars ballroom with gold that is supposed to impress world leaders, at the same time that he's slashing your health care and threatening to furlough or fire 750,000 workers. And I'm going to give you an answer that may, looking at some of these other questions, that may actually be similar to some of the other questions we have on here. And it's about your power. It's why I'm doing this podcast. It is such an important question. And here's the thing. I think that we as Americans got kind of complacent that democracy would survive in America, that we had all these checks and balances built in. We sort of thought that everything would continue through the toughest times because we had these checks and balances built into the Constitution, right? We took care of it. Our framing founders took care of this. And specifically, we were like, yeah, we've got a couple of key things built into the Constitution, which we do. The separation of powers. The separation of powers means that we've got the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And all of them have to check each other so that one branch doesn't become too powerful, doesn't overtake things. But as we're seeing, that separation of powers just isn't working. And the first big check that's built into the Constitution is the fact that Congress is in Article 1, right? The powers of Congress, which are only for Congress, that's in Article 1 of the Constitution, the most important and the biggest article in the Constitution. And that is the power of Congress to stop an out-of-control president from taking over all power and to preserve certain functions just for Congress. Like, for example, the ability to authorize money, right? Or to establish or get rid of federal agencies. That is all Article 1 congressional power. Now, here's the problem. To exercise that power, you have to have people that are in the majority party who are willing to stand up to a president, because the minority party doesn't have enough votes to do it on our own. So that means that we have to have, it's a simple majority in the House, you have to have people on the other side who say, whoa, you're not doing this right. Now that's happening on the Epstein side, right? We've got Thomas Massey, we've got a few Republicans who are like, hold on, release all those Epstein files. So there's some accountability there of saying to the president, wait a second, you have to do this. But when it comes to most of the things that we have been seeing, including slashing funding, including slashing agencies unconstitutionally, firing workers unconstitutionally, we can't stop that in Congress unless there are people in the majority party who are willing to stand up to the president. And time again, Speaker Mike Johnson and Senate Majority Leader John Thune are instead acting like a rubber stamp, right? Just stamping that paper. Yeah, we're going to let you get away with anything you want, even if your presidential power is undermining our congressional power. The Constitution actually requires that both parties be committed to upholding the Constitution and that both parties are willing to speak up when an authoritarian president is undermining our own congressional power. That's just not the case right now. So that check is not really happening for the vast majority of things. The second check is the courts and the judiciary. So here it's mixed. Sometimes we actually have some really good temporary injunctions from lower courts, right? When lower courts make decisions about cases and they say, wait a second, that's exceeded presidential authority, we're going to stop that. They put a temporary injunction on. But increasingly what's been happening is this mega Supreme Court, which has several justices that are bought and paid for by the very people that come before them. The Supreme Court has been consolidating power in itself by overturning those lower court decisions, sometimes without even any explanation, like just one sentence, we overturn this, and allowing those things to go forward. And that's really dangerous for so many reasons, including that it's undermining the decisions of those lower courts. And it's giving all of the power to the Supreme Court, and, often using this thing called a shadow docket, where they can just overturn a case, just a temporary injunction without any explanation whatsoever. Now, as I said, the grift and the corruption is stunning. It's stunning in the Trump White House. It's stunning with cabinet members like Tom Homan, who was apparently caught on a recent investigation with a sack of cash, who's just benefiting off of the incarceration of immigrants by giving all these private for-profit detention companies a bunch of money without any contracts. These folks have no experience. People are dying. All these immigrants are getting put into detention. Well, that's also true unfortunately, with the Supreme Court. There are several of these justices who have been getting luxury vacations and RVs from the very billionaires who are coming before them and saying, decide this case in our favor. And those billionaires are the same ones that are propping up the administration. So here's a situation now where an authoritarian leader and his billionaire buddies seemingly have the majority party in Congress and the majority of the Supreme Court, the right-wing Supreme Court as it is, in their pockets. So those are two really important checks and balances that the founders built in that they thought would work that are not working. So what's the third and only other real check? It's the power of the people. It's the power of the people to build nonviolent resistance movements and actually fight back. And that's why our voices and our power are so important. And it's part of why I started this podcast, so that we can all recognize our power and understand that we have a role in this moment and that there's actually a lot we can do to protect this country that we all love so dearly. So I guess the answer to how do we stop this president and his corrupt cronies is we need you to stand up. We need you to call your members of Congress. If you have a Democratic senator, think about the states that have Republican senators that you have friends in, and make a list of 10 people in those Republican states and tell them to call their senator and tell them to save our health care, that they should not be pushing to restart government without a commitment that we're going to cancel the cuts and stop healthcare prices and costs from rising for the American people. That is really, really important right now. All right. Second question here. What can be done to protect DACA? Yeah. I've worked on this issue of immigration for, I think it's like 20 years now. Long before I ever came to Congress, I was an immigrant rights activist, and I was actually on the outside pushing for the DACA program to happen with the Obama administration, with all the courageous dreamers and the dreamer movement that is really talk about using your power, used its power to make the DACA program a reality. That program, deferred action program for dreamers that gives legal status to temporary legal status to dreamers, that continues to make its way through the courts. The Trump administration has sued to get rid of it. States across the country have sued. And so ultimately this thing is going to go to the Supreme Court. And it may be, I don't want to predict anything, it may be that this MAGA right Supreme Court, this Trump Supreme Court, sides with his administration and strikes down the whole program. And if that is the case, the pressure is on Congress even more than ever to finally pass legislation, because DACA was a program that was established administratively by the Obama administration, because Congress wouldn't do anything to move immigration legislation because of Republicans. Let me be really clear. We passed comprehensive immigration reform bill back in 2013 in the Senate, the U.S. Senate, with 68 bipartisan votes. And then when it came to the House, it was Republicans in charge of the House, and they wouldn't bring it to the floor for a vote because they knew it would pass. And guess what? They want to leave immigrants out there as a political tool to just blame for everything, right? Whether it's losing your health care or losing your job or whatever. They don't want you to think about the fact that it's billionaires. So anyway, the pressure is going to be on Congress more than ever to finally pass legislation that provides permanent protections and a roadmap to citizenship for dreamers. And DACA is an incredibly important transformational program, but because it was done through the executive branch, it's always been temporary and kind of always at risk, right? Because it was done just through executive authority, executive action, and it's been sued in court. Those lawsuits have been going through court ever since it started, and it's temporary, it's not permanent. And so I'm really proud that when Democrats had the majority in the House, we passed the Dream and Promise Act. And I'm on the Judiciary Committee, and I was part of the big negotiations to help make that happen. And the Dream and Promise Act included citizenship for dreamers and for temporary protected status holders, right? We passed that bill not just once, but twice, with every single Democrat voting in support. And so we need Republicans to stand up. Dreamers, TPS holders, every district across the country doing incredibly important, critical work. They are us. And so once again, to support DACA, what we need is for your member of Congress to hear from you, to hear from the American people about why this is so critical. So let's put the pressure on to protect dreamers, and let's get that movement started. The Supreme Court decision hasn't come out yet, but it will eventually probably make its way up to the Supreme Court, but we should get ready now. All right. Let's see. Next question we have, this is a really important one. I'm worried about the shutdown being used as a cover for more military involvement in our cities. What can be done to stop that? There is a 19th century federal law known as the Posse Comitatus Act that strictly limits the role of federal troops in domestic law enforcement. In these really, really narrow, legally defined cases, for instance, if they were suppressing an insurrection, okay? If the Trump administration exceeds these limitations, then states and localities can sue the administration to block it from using troops for law enforcement purposes. And this is a really terrifying situation where Trump is using the U.S. military on U.S. soil against U.S. citizens. That's just incredibly dangerous. So in September, a federal judge ruled that Trump's use of the National Guard in Los Angeles was unlawful when the troops conducted security patrols, crowd control, traffic control, riot control, and Portland and Oregon just filed a similar lawsuit to stop Trump's deployment of troops there. Now, here's the lower court, higher court issue again. Although lower courts have issued some really good rulings, the Supreme Court has undone some of them. So, for example, a lower court judge had issued an order blocking Trump from rounding up immigrants based on race, ethnicity, language ability, but the Supreme Court just very recently lifted that injunction without any explanation. There was a dissenting opinion, or there was an opinion in favor of lifting the order from Justice Kavanaugh that I think most people think was incredibly, basically allowed racial discrimination, discrimination based on language, race, just how somebody looks, what street corner they stand on, what language they speak. But the rest of the Supreme Court majority lifted that order without any explanation. Now, we can hope that the courts are going to order Trump to stop deploying troops to major cities, but we have to also prepare for the possibility that the Supreme Court sides with Trump again, in which case it will all once again come back to us, the people. And I know this is really frustrating, but this is what it is. It's why I do my resistance lab trainings for nonviolent resistance. And you can check that out on my website. But here's the thing. Our cities are not training grounds. And U.S. citizens are not the enemy within, as Trump and Hegseth said earlier this week in this incredibly disturbing couple of speeches that really made me think over and over again about how unwell and dangerous our president is. And as we're seeing, shutdown or not, they're militarizing our cities. And shout out to Free DC and the folks in DC who really stood up and joyfully and forcefully stood up when the National Guard was deployed in DC. That's what we have to do over and over again. We have to stand up non-violently, peacefully. Do not give them any opportunity to say that there's a riot, that we have to come in, that we have to suppress and quench the riot. We have to stand up non-violently, peacefully, forcefully, joyfully against these unlawful reaches by the administration. And there's some really great tools out of DC and the Free DC movement, lessons about how to do that and how to organize and how neighbors organized in neighborhoods with bicycle patrols, with ways to check what was happening, with ways to protect people, particularly immigrants who were getting stopped at traffic stops and things like that. So this is really, really important that we prepare for this in our cities, and we also prepare with all of our elected officials. I know here in Seattle, our mayor, Bruce Harrell, and our Attorney General, Nick Brown, just did a press conference about this. Our governor, Bob Ferguson, has been really clear. They've all been working with me. We've been working together to make sure that Trump understands he can't send his troops into Seattle, and we're going to fight back against that nonviolently, peacefully. All right. I think we have time maybe for one more question. Okay, I'm going to take this billionaire's net worth keeps going up while the rest of us can barely pay for groceries, because I think this one is really, really, really important. And so the short answer is, yeah, it's not okay. The top 1% of Americans control nearly 30% of the wealth in this country, and the bottom 50% of Americans has less than 2.5%. And we are just seeing this administration show you who they care about. They consistently put their billionaires first. Their big bad betrayal bill had a permanent tax break written into it for the richest people in this country. And that's why I'm really proud to lead with Elizabeth Warren the Ultra Millionaire Tax Act. Now, this is a bill you can immediately get your member of Congress to get on. Call them up. Call up your House member. Call up your senator, and tell them to sign on to the Warren-Jayapal Ultra Millionaire Tax Act, which puts a tax on the massive wealth that these billionaires have. And it basically says, let's be fair about this, okay? It's not extreme at all. It could be much more extreme and still be fair, by the way. But we started by just saying we're going to put a tax on the top 0.05% of households so that they have to chip in an extra 2 cents on every dollar above 50 million. All right, so your first 50 million, if you've got $50 million in wealth, fear not, your first $50 million is tax-free. But if you have 50 million plus $1, then you pay 2 cents on every dollar over 50 million. That alone would bring in $3 trillion in revenue over 10 years. That's funding for schools, it's funding for healthcare, it's funding for housing. It is time that in this country, the wealthiest pay their fair share, because no one should be raking in billions while families can't afford rent or groceries. Okay, I lied. I think I'm going to do one more question. Do I have time for one more question? I'm asking my team. All right, we got to do one more quick question. A lot of people saying they feel defeated. And so, look, I get it. This is totally exhausting. And everything about this podcast is about how you understand that hopelessness and powerlessness are the tools of the oppressor. This administration is targeting people at every turn. They're stomping on our Constitution. They're doing all of it with very little or no pushback from their own party. And so this feeling of powerlessness, of being overwhelmed, that is exactly what they want us to feel. And we have to fight back against it. And honestly, that's the hardest thing. But what I also know as a longtime organizer is that the hard times are actually what make the strongest organizers, right? It's like a diamond that's being created under all this pressure. This beautiful thing gets created. And it's that center core of belief that the people have power, that we have power, and that nobody can take it away from us. And so I just want you to know that that's what this podcast is all about. And it's really about my belief that our collective love, our collective strength, our collective power are greater than their hate. And so I want to thank you all for tuning in to this special episode of Use the Power You Have. We'll have a guest next time around again, but let us know if you like this Q&A thing. We'll just make it a component of the podcast going forward. In the meantime, I'm Pramila Jayapal, your host. Thank you for joining us, and talk to you soon.